Welcome, Left Reckoning patrons. I'm Matt Leck. With me is David Griscom. Hello, David. How are you?
Hey, man. Not doing too bad.
We're recording a little bit in advance because you are going to be in my neck of the woods later this week. But I wanted to talk about something. I'm doing some reading lately, David. A couple books here. One, Border Games, the politics of policing, the U.S.-Mexico divide. That's by a guy named Peter Andreas. And then The Children of NAFTA, Labor Wars on the U.S.-Mexico Border by David Bacon. And to kind of address something I feel like is business that hasn't been really attended to well by this whole Bernie movement in a while. Like, one thing, like, I wish Bernie was a little bit better at, because he was deployed by certain people saying even Bernie supports tight border controls, right? I think like this sort of conversation we need to like figure out a quicker path through this issue. Mm-hmm. And a couple things I think these books are informing is like on the Border Games point, it is about how like this sort of idea that we've ever controlled this or that it's controllable at all. Like that's a myth like that sets up more and more contracts. And this is like something that we just isn't doable. To the extent that we close it down, one area gets through in another, and to the extent we've gone to actually try to do it, we're killing people in the Rio Grande with razor wire, right? And it pulled this quote also from John McCain, which goes like this. It's easy to talk of a war on drugs, involve our military in an anti-drug program, pour billions into the effort, and then disguise a lack of success with reassuring rhetoric. And this is in mid-2000s, McCain said this. The measures of success that are being made public have virtually no practical meaning. For example, efforts to assist seizures are measured in terms of the amount of drugs seized with no effort to release such data to the percentage of total drugs that get through, or to whether seizures have any meaningful impact on the main smuggling networks. Another equally meaningless measure of capabilities to report the number of detections, arrests, or intercepts with no attempt to relate this to the number of successful crossings or actual convictions, or whether such actions have any real effect on the flow of drugs. And yet, like, is that anywhere in this conversation about like stopping drugs or stopping the record at the bipartisan approach to this crisis we supposedly deal with at the border? And I think the other thing is to kind of bring that whole into relief is what's talked about in David Bacon's book, The Children of NAFTA. And it's alluded to in Peter Andreas too, which is that this whole theater at the border was staged with one eye on the NAFTA negotiations, with full realization that liberalizing trade and money flows between these countries is going to set up a problem with people flows too. And it, like, Peter Andreas' book goes into like, yeah, they were specifically kept the drug conversation out because it'd probably blow it up because it's not actually solvable with regards to this thing. And yeah, like, it's so clear that even now to this day, we keep shoveling money. This is like a military industrial complex type of thing, right? We keep shoveling money at this problem to obscure this actual class divide, this class problem that's going on with working people, that's going on with workers on both sides of the border. And before I let you come in, David, I just want to like let people know how we're in this fucking circle and the need to get out of it. Here's an ad from 1996. This is Bob Dole against Clinton.
2 million illegal aliens in California, 20,000 in our prisons, 400,000 crowd our schools. Every year they cost us $3 billion tax dollars. Bill Clinton has fought California in court, forcing us to support them. Clinton fought Prop 187, cut border agents, gave citizenship to aliens with criminal records. We pay the taxes. We are the victims. Our children get shortchanged. If Clinton wins, we lose.
So yeah, there's the attack ad. Now, I mean, there's certain factual things you could say, like, which is a lot of people, immigrants are often net payers into, and on balance, net payers into tax services, tax coffers, because they can't actually take services out. I mean, education stuff is slightly different, and we could talk about the Bushes, who are good on that sort of front. But just to play the response that the Clintons had before we get into this, it wasn't. It's basically the same as you have Republicans and Democrats now. We don't want to look weak.
Another negative Republican ad. Wrong. President Clinton increased border patrols 40% to catch illegal.
No, just want to say, like, the music.
Both of these are
cues-
like such. I mean, this is not the focus of it, but like the style is pretty like amazingly 90s for both.
I
of them.
know. It's so funny. It's like the same message content, but yeah, the form is so of its time, and the switch between the like, oh, there's a shark in the water music cues to like the, oh, happy Bill Clinton's on screen is great.
Another negative Republican ad. Wrong. President Clinton increased border patrols 40% to catch illegal immigrants. Record number of deportations. No welfare for illegal aliens.
And for those just listening to this, as that piano plays, you have exploitative imagery of immigrants coming into the country, climbing over fences and that sort of thing.
Republicans opposed protecting U.S. workers from replacement by foreign workers. The Dole-Gingrich budget tried to repeal 100,000 new police. Dole-Gingrich tried to slash school anti-drug programs. Only President Clinton's plan protects our jobs, our values.
So, I mean, yeah, the more shit changes, the more it stays the same.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and yeah, it is true. I mean, you're seeing the same kind of things. I mean, like, I think there's a point to be made, for example, about the lack, unfortunately, of difference between Trump and Biden when it comes to the border, right? The fact that, like, there are kids in cages under Trump, and generally, like, that system has not changed dramatically under Joe Biden. And you could definitely see Joe Biden in a certain context sort of hinting at that, in the same way Obama loved to point out after his presidency that oil production increased every year when he was the president of the United States, right? I mean, there's so much to get into. And I mean, like, before we talk maybe about like the politics and the economics, I mean, just want to talk on like the human level, right? Because like right now, I think it is important to note that the immigration that we're seeing into the U.S. is markedly different from what was even happening in the 90s, because while you still like, so much of the conversation is pretty much about like the United States' relationship with Mexico. While, in fact, right now, a lot of people who are coming over the border are people from Central America, Venezuelans, and Cubans, right? So there has been a shift. So in the sense of, there are larger populations of people fleeing conditions, oftentimes created by American foreign policy, that's creating that. But like, just to focus on like the U.S. Mexico relationship and the relationship between people. I mean, if you look, for example, across like the Texas border, El Paso and Juarez, Brownsville and Matamoros, like, one thing that you can see really clearly is that these are cities, right? In any other context, you wouldn't even think to consider them as two separate entities, but it's only because we have the scar of a border there. And like, it is really, really brutal. And I think it's worth taking a second to think about what this means for people. If you go and you spend time in El Paso, if you spend time in Brownsville, you spend time in Eagle Pass, like, you will talk to folks and they have family on the other side, right? They might have been in that area for hundreds of years. Okay. And now, especially as we've, increased the militarization of the border, I mean, families are really torn apart, where people could be literally probably, living miles away from each other in the physical sense, but might not have been able to see each other in years. Particularly for people who are living on the Mexican side of the border, because it's extremely difficult and arduous to cross the border. And it's so unnatural in any context, but even historically for those regions, it's always sort of been a joint area. Ironically, where is there a kind of like a borderless system? Well, it's not for people, but it's for capital, right? And for people who don't know about the maquiladora system, we have factories that are literally right over the Texas border in Mexico, but they get treated in the American market. The products that were created there get treated in the American market as if they are made in America, right?
Yeah.
So while the people who are working there might not be able to go and visit, their family in Brownsville, right, if they're working in Mount Morris, their products that they're shipping out are treated as American goods, right? And it's just one of those, like, I think really telling examples of the kind of absurd reality of capitalism, right? Where it's like things and money have this kind of freedom, but people are sort of scarred and prevented from being able to interact with one another. I mean, it's the height of cruelty.
Yeah, all to avoid labor protections. Like child labor is not legal in Mexico either. The way it's allowed here is basically because you have oppressed and legally
exploited.
Exactly. And yeah, like in the children of NAFTA thing, like I think that is like one optimistic thing, and the book was written in 2004, so we haven't seen this yet, but like we need to get to a point where we talk about how this has been used as an end around all workers, and like we just never talk about, we just haven't been taught to look at trade agreements like that. Like even when Trump renegotiated this shit, that wasn't like the dominant. Yeah.
It was just trying to encourage AMLO to do more enforcement on his side, right?
And yeah, and sorry, the contradiction though between, we have all these people who say like, actually, I support crypto because I'm anti-government.
Yeah.
While also supporting, because they like money to be able to go around border protection, stuff like that, while saying, hey, it's just practical that we need to continue militarizing the border to do something that, to try to do something that has never been done, which is to control a border like that. You want to control it where it needs controlling, which is in the workplace, right?
Yeah.
Like you need to not be allowed to exploit workers wherever. But of course, the entire reason that these systems have been set up, whether it's a border or NAFTA, is to do that.
So, and like this, like, let me just give like a little perspective on like what like a liberal argument from like a Texan would be on this. And like, George W. Bush, for people who are maybe too young or don't remember, he sort of ran, I mean, like compared to like Republican rhetoric on the border today, would sort of come off as dovish. And like, this isn't to praise him, because the second that the Republican Party started hooting and hollering about his guest worker program, so W put forward a guest worker program that people could come into the country, and work for a temporary period for a period of 3 years. They had to maintain a job. They couldn't get arrested. And if they ever lost their job or anything like that, they would be expelled, right? That is far from like a left-wing proposal, right? Because what does that do? It creates tremendous amounts of power for bosses, right? Because if your entire like ability to stay in the country is reliant on, how happy your boss is with you, I mean, that's just a system that's rife for abuse. But I just bring that up because you would never imagine DeSantis or Abbott or Trump ever talking like that. Today, but like, so to give like just a quick, like, kind of Texas common sense liberal argument, right? This isn't the radical one, but the argument has always been this, is like people have always crossed the border, as if for people who are familiar with the border region, as I was saying, it's like, these cities are literally, they're separated by a fence in the middle of them, right? It's insane. So people have always been going back and forth. And typically what would happen in the U.S. for most of like Texas's history is whenever there were labor shortages, primarily in the South, but throughout the entire state, if there's a labor shortage, then, you would get migrant workers would come up and work, and they would work until there weren't jobs, and then they would go home, right? Yep. Or they would return back to Mexico, because the only reason they were here was to work. And oftentimes people only did it temporarily. Now, since we have a hard border, and it's arduous and dangerous to cross, if you get over, you don't go back. If you're crossing illegally, right? Not going through the proper channels or whatnot, because you don't want to have to go through that crisis again. So ironically, and again, this is just like the kind of liberal argument that people make on this, is that like ironically, like the hard border system has meant that more and more people are coming over and staying, versus the previous system where people would come over temporarily when there were jobs to be filled, and they would leave when there weren't jobs to be filled. This also means that there's more pressure, for example, for families to come over because you want your family to be with you, versus maybe just like a younger like man to come and work a kind of job for 4 or 5 years, send money back home, and then return after a period of time, right? So the irony of like the hard border policy has been that it's encouraged people who might not want to stay in the United States to stay here. Right. And I mean, like, we're not even talking yet about the horrors that are occurring on our southern border. I mean, we did a segment on that recently, and I have to say, I don't know if it hits you as hard, Matt, but like the line from the whistleblower that when he said, like, I think we've crossed the line into the inhumane. I mean, it's really striking to me, because it is inhumane. It is evil to be putting barbed wire in the water like that, and scarring a really beautiful place of the world. And turning it into like a war zone, into a horror zone, into a death zone. This encourages the power of the coyotes, human smugglers. They get to charge more. They're
charge more.
Demand. It doesn't do these things. And on the drug aspect, it's like, well, AMLO makes this point all the time. It's like, the U.S. is always talking to us about the Mexican drug problem, and like, look. There is a problem with cartels in Mexico, particularly in like northern Mexico. I mean, there is like a legitimate, and this is one thing, this is a tangent, but like, when we talk about like the military and policing and stuff, there is a legitimate crisis in Mexico about, to use the kind of classic political science definition, the monopoly of violence by the state. Right. There are areas where it's just like, no, there are gangs that are in control. So AMLO getting harsher, and mobilizing military in Mexico, it's a very different context, for example, than what's happening in the U.S. But that's a whole other thing. But anyways, AMLO makes this point about the drug trade. It's like, well, the United States gets mad about the drugs. But first of all, what about the guns, right? Because there's a two-way street where the guns are coming south from the United States into Mexico, and the drugs are going north. But again, why are the drugs going north? Because there's Americans love drugs. We had Benjamin Fong on the program recently to talk about that. So there's a massive market in the United States for drugs that these gangs and cartels are providing. So anyways, this like one-sided aspect of it, where it's just like the Mexican failed state is basically sending drugs into our country, is absurd.
But on that note, like, yes, but this is just the way the fucking goods are flowing. It's true that our country is being flooded by drugs from Mexico. Guess where drugs are flooding into Canada from? The United States of good old America.
That's
right?
True too. Yeah, you're right.
And so like, it's just like, and all it is it's like pointing at a waterfall saying, hey, give us a giant government contracts to go like stand in that for a while, and we'll like take some good photo ops with the water, but it's still fucking rushing past. And you want to deal with the drugs thing, you deal with addiction like what it is, not a police issue. Why the fuck do we have to learn this over and over again? Addiction and drugs is a public health issue. We need to deal with it as a public health issue. We need to deal with the labor stuff as a labor issue. We need to deal with terrorists as a terrorism issue. Like that has kind of gone out there. We do not need to keep giving money and building this giant bureaucracy of fucking border Gestapo. Another section from this Peter Andreas book, the rapid growth, and this is from the Bill Clinton era. So Bill Clinton was right when he's saying, hey, we're not pussies on the border. The rapid growth of INS, Immigration Naturalization Services, I believe,
throwback.
right? The rapid growth of INS was particularly impressive because it took place in an era otherwise characterized by government downsizing. While most federal agencies were struggling in the face of budget cuts, the INS was struggling to manage its fast-paced expansion. The INS established an around-the-clock hotline for prospective applicants, hired an advertising agency, expanded its recruitment at colleges, military bases, and job fairs, and began promoting its careers on the internet. The positions Border Patrol agent and immigration inspector were listed as 2 of the top 10 areas of job growth in the federal government. Thus, although devolution, less federal spending, and more responsibility transferred to state governments have become a popular political theme, trends in immigration control push in the opposite direction. And it's a classic case of like, your budget is what your fucking state is, right? Like it really tells you where your priorities are and what you're what kind of future you're building.
Yeah, no, 100%. And like, let's talk about budget for a second, because, here's where I'll say something that might, make some folks mad, but like, we have to be honest about why these things are the way that they are. why is the border such a hot button issue in Texas? Why is it so successful politically? One, because, Texas mirrors a lot of the country where fear mongering around immigrants plays really well, right? So most of the stuff that's happening on the border right now, the horror show, that is both for like a domestic audience in Texas, to get like right wingers in Dallas and in Houston and Tyler and Abilene, worked up and excited for Greg Abbott, but also for an exterior market, right? To get guys in Arkansas and in Kansas and in New York or wherever. Oh, Abbott's strong on the border, right? But so that's the theater of it, which, I don't say theater to dismiss it because it's like human cost, human sacrifice. Right. Literally happening for this. Yeah. But then here's the other question politically. What's going on in South Texas where you are starting to see success for more right-wing Republican candidates in areas that traditionally were like the blue wall of Texas, were very strong Democratic run? Well, going back to what you were just saying, Matt, like the budget tells you a lot. When this becomes one of the best jobs in the area, you get more and more people who are loyal to this system of harassment, regardless of their ethnic makeup, right?
Yep, absolutely.
So what happens with the budget is like these are parts of the state, parts of the nation that are some of the most underinvested in. They're forgotten for the most part. I mean, a lot of Texans have no clue. Probably couldn't name a city on the border, maybe other than El Paso, because it operates, for historical reasons and also for reasons of capitalism, has been underinvested in and undercared for. So the budget tells you a lot, right? There's only one real kind of government jobs program or economic development program, and it's militarization and brutality at the border, right? You're going to get people who are going to be more and more comfortable with it. On top of that, there is an issue when you have mass migrations of human beings crossing over the border, coming into cities and towns, right? It's just like a logistical, I'm not even talking like moral, it's just like logistical. There's a lot of responsibility that these border towns sort of have to absorb because we don't have a rational immigration system. Right. So there is resentment and a real desire for there to be something that makes more sense. I don't think there's a tremendous amount of support for what's going on right now. I think that there's going to be a big backlash politically because it's just so horrific. And even like right wing ranchers and stuff like that are getting pissed at what Border Patrol is doing on their land. But the fact is that, for both Democrats and Republicans have refused to take this question seriously, right? And, what would like a social democratic system look like, right? I think there are some real questions that would have to be asked. I mean, I think the first and simplest one is like, I think that like take a page from the playbook of the right here. Like, I think a very humane system would be to have people on the border, institutions, organizations on the border that say, hey, welcome to the United States of America. Where are you trying to go? And move them. Not in the way that Abbott's doing, where they're lying to people. They're saying, hey, there's a place that has jobs and pay, and opportunities for you. And they put them on a bus and they drop them in a parking lot near Martha's Vineyard, right? That's cruel. Right. That's evil. But I think a social democratic system, for example, you come into this country, I want to go to Chicago, boom, here's a bus. We'll get you up there, right? And then when you get there, we'll have social services to like get you incorporated into the system. The next question would have to be labor, right? Because while I do think that like we should go back to like we should eradicate the hard border, you have to make sure, for example, that capitalists and bosses aren't able to use migrant labor basically to undercut union workers and workers in general to say, right. Oh, well, if you make a big stink at your job, well, I'll just replace you with someone who's going to accept a much lower wage than you, right? You can't let that happen. And, I think there's people smarter and more engaged than me who can figure that out. But, the best way to handle that, I think, basic protections for all workers, regardless of status, would be one thing. I think if you had a program that was saying like, hey, we do have labor shortage in some industries. We do want workers to work in them. I mean, like, so who are some of the most exploited workers, abused workers in the American system right now? People working in meat packing and people working in the fields, picking fruits and vegetables, right?
Right.
And those systems are knowns by the government. That like there are people who are working there who are migrant workers. They don't have access to the same kind of legal protections or feel that they don't have access to the same kind of legal protections. So eradicating that kind of known thing there, so you have a baseline standard for labor. So if the question is that we have a labor shortage and not a shortage of how much bosses are willing to pay people for their labor, or a shortage in how much bosses care about the conditions that their workers are working in. Like, these are things that, like, there's an aspect to this that is border policy, but will also have to be labor policy. For example, like if we wanted to, I'm sort of outlining, like if we were in a transitional government, right? What that would kind of look like. And like, you have to have real investment. The thing is, right now, is what we throw money to the border to do right now is to build up fences, to get helicopters for these freaks. And now my governor putting barbed wire and shit like that. You know, you would want to have a well-funded border so that, like, people who are coming into this country, we can, look out and see who's coming into the country, right? So we don't have a situation where it is a free-for-all. I don't think we might be in disagreement about that, Matt, but like, I don't think that like an absolute free-for-all and having no sense of what's going over the border, who's coming over the border, is like something that we should be advocating for. But like waging
EU.
war on human beings trying to go and live with their family, or just trying to come into this country to have a better life, right? I want that to be something that's available to people 100%.
It's been a while since I traveled in Europe, but my recollections, I didn't need to show my passport between like Belgium and France or whatever, and like that's and we should be tracking whatever, like, but. I mean, I do agree. I think that some sense of order, and also like
just fund that in a way
service.
that's not punitive, right? Like, it's not militaristic, because like the idea, because if you've ever crossed the border into Mexico, some of those guys are very professional, and I will say I probably have a very different experience than others because of my skin color. But it's an intense experience regardless. If even if you know that you're fine, there's a bunch of guys with guns and fences, and it's intense, right? I'm talking about a completely different kind of way to sort of be able to do, just the kind of basic monitoring of what's happening, but something that's not this harsh and difficult and cruel. And because at the end of the day, a shitload of people cross over the border every day legally, right? We're not even talking about migration, just like trade and human beings who have visas or the ability to come to the United States, and vice versa, right? You have a different kind of system. I mean, like, compare, have you crossed the border into Canada? I don't know what that experience is like.
I did. I've done it both pre 9/11 and post 9/11, and I don't remember there being much at all. I honestly think it was like a shack on the side of the road with a guy. I don't even know if he came out the first time, and then post is a little bit more of a
when you come back into the country.
Yeah, no, like even the first time, like I don't remember. I mean, I was very young.
Yeah.
I can say that like pre and post 9/11, it changed significantly.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's and Byron Dorgan, the senator who was good on Wall Street, was very much give us those contracts too. We want to expand our border policing capabilities up here. North Dakotans want those jobs as well.
So like, I mean, like, to put like a cap on like, the thing is like, what we're doing right now is some of the most inhumane shit, and it is the height of evil. It is so cruel, and you'd have to explain it to somebody, right? Like, if somebody like had no context of American politics and history, if you were just to take somebody who had no conception of it and you showed them a map of Texas and Mexico and you explained what's happening on this line, right, you would be perplexed, right? Because it is just so absurd. And like, sometimes I know this is like might seem like a goofy point to make, but sometimes it's really important to like just remember like what like a natural human would sort of think of something like this. In the same way, like when we're talking about policing, that like it is natural if somebody is pinning you to the ground to push back a little bit or to resist a little bit. We know the context as to why you act the way that you do to prevent it getting worse, but like you should always be able to hold that truth in your head that like there's something wrong here. There's something being imposed on us here. And it's the same thing with the border. Right. So like, what you do need is like, there does need to be more, there needs to be a redirection of funding on the border, and this militarization, and like actually give services to people who are crossing into the border, and also provide for McAllen, provide for Eagle Pass, provide for El Paso, parts of the country that have been ignored politically, both by the state of Texas and by the country. And then you have to do labor protections for people, because what is happening right now is there is a whole host of businesses in this country that have basically feel they have the ability to skirt labor law because they have terrorized people who are afraid to stand up for themselves because they know that ICE is around the corner. I mean, I've seen these kind of things happen in my working life, in my life, where people are being wronged by the state or being wronged by their boss. And when they start sticking up for themselves, that boss or the state will say, we're going to come at you if you make us think about this. That is extremely evil, can only exist in a situation like the one that we've created, and it's not an accident. And again, like, we have a long history in this country of a relationship with Mexico and the border, and this chapter, particularly that started in like the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, is a new one of this really harsh and brutal border. And it's something that we shouldn't accept. It's cruel, it's anti-human, and to make the kind of starry-eyed point, it's also it's anti-American in the general sense. We all know the propaganda or whatnot, but look, I think it's worth being able to make the point that, like, look, the idea of this place, for better or for worse, has been that people should be able to come here to start a new life. And having this hard border is just is such an antithesis to our values as a country, and also to our values as Texans. Like, I'm sorry, you can't be a Texan and like have this anti-Mexican shit. It's like, it's our history and our culture in a way too, right? We eat the same foods, we're part of the same country. You can't be a guy who knows a lot of good Mexican restaurants in your town and also hate the people coming over from that country into the US.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there's more on this, but I think it was good to sort of take a little bit of a historical lens and see that, like, this has been something that's been cooking up, and I just, like, I don't know if it's gonna. I mean, like, maybe last point before we go, Matt. I mean, what's happening right now is probably as the worst that it's ever been. I mean, this is some of the worst stuff that we've ever seen on the border, right? I mean, as far as I know, this is some of the cruelest and anti-human shit. I know the Biden administration is suing Greg Abbott. I would like them to be a little bit more proactive on this kind of stuff, because, man, you want to kick this shit around the courts for 4 or 5 years while mothers are having miscarriages because they're, caught in barbed wire. And this is not something to play around with or to bide your time on, because it is affecting people right now. I mean, it's better than nothing, but the whole, like, there's no credibility in Democrats saying, trust us, our lawyers got it. No, and
following Roe versus Wade.
When it comes to detentions of human beings on the border and the abuse that's going on to them, there has to be, this is a time that, like, I think making sure that you're keeping your eye on the border. And, like, look, I think it's worthwhile to point out the hypocrisy of a lot of people, including some progressives, who made a big deal about Trump's border policies, who have been very quiet since Joe Biden has taken power. I mean, look, like, Joe Biden basically kept Trump's policies, but created an app that can't scan faces of people with darker skin complexions than mine, right? I mean, that's not acceptable. And it's very frustrating to me to see how many people have sort of, gone out to brunch on this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a morbid symptom. Like, that's the sort of thing where it's like, we all expect that Republicans are hiring Nazi staffers and shit like that. But that the Democrats, like that, like, it's basically another fucking tech grift. Like, like that, it's solutioneering. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, and that's all we're going to get until we take a more are able to, like, force a more affirmative approach on this, as opposed to, like, the standard fucking Bill Clinton to Joe Biden shit that we've been getting for so long.
100%. Well, we'll keep covering and talking to more folks on this program. Everyone, have a good rest of your Sunday, and we're going to be back. Reminder, we're doing our show on Wednesday.
One note on this: have you seen the Wrath of Grapes on the farm workers documentary?
The Wrath of Grapes?
Yeah, it's called The Wrath of Grapes.
Okay. No, I haven't.
I think that might
I
be
know
a
the Steinbeck
future.
novel, obviously, but
No, yeah. Well, this is specifically about the farm workers, table grape stuff, and might be a future Left Reckoning Twitch movie night.
I'm like vaguely familiar with that, right? Because like Cesar Chavez would like refuse to like, have table grapes on the table. That was like a big symbol for a long time. Yeah.
So maybe we'll do that.
Deep dive into that. I'd love to.
All right, folks.
Good weekend. See y'all on Wednesday.
Peace.